Hi, I'm Margaret, and I'm 72 years old, and for months now I've been carrying something I never thought I would have to say out loud to strangers, but I need to say it anyway. My son sold my car to help pay for his wedding, and on the day of that wedding I didn't even have a seat at the table. I found out my car was gone before I found out I wasn't invited, and somehow the second discovery hurt worse than the first. I want to tell you that I screamed, that I threw something, that I made a scene in front of the whole family. But that isn't who I am, and it never has been. What I did instead was quieter and slower, and in its own way it mattered more than any shouting ever could have. I paid for my son's wedding with my car, and I want you to understand exactly how that happened, because I think some of you already know this feeling in your bones. Have you ever given everything you had to someone you loved, and then watched them treat you like you were the one who owed them something? Have you ever stood in an empty garage and felt your whole chest go cold? Not because of the car, but because of what the empty space meant about the person who emptied it. If you know that feeling, I want you to tell me where you're listening from tonight, because it helps me to know I'm not just talking into the dark. Before I go further, if stories like mine mean something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. It doesn't cost anything, and it's the only way I know to keep these stories reaching the people who need to hear that they aren't alone. Just tap that button under this video. It takes a second, and it means the next story finds you automatically. Now let me take you back to where this really started. I live in Dayton, Ohio, in the same small brick house my husband Harold and I bought in 1982, back when the mortgage payment felt like a mountain, and we celebrated the day we finally paid it off with a bottle of sparkling cider because neither of us drank. Harold worked at the assembly plant for 34 years, and I kept books for a hardware store downtown until my knees wouldn't let me stand on concrete floors anymore. We never had much, but we never owed anybody either, and that mattered to both of us more than almost anything. Harold passed 6 years ago, quietly in his sleep, the kind of death people call a mercy, though I never much cared for that word. Since then I've lived alone in this house, and I've managed. My pension and his life insurance cover what I need, and I've always been careful with money, the way you learn to be when you grew up with very little and built everything yourselves, piece by piece, dollar by dollar. My son Michael is 31 now, and he was the light of our whole household growing up, smart and funny and quick with people in a way that neither Harold nor I ever quite were. I paid for things for Michael his whole life without complaint. His braces, his car insurance in his 20s, the security deposit on his first apartment, because that is what mothers do, or at least what I believed mothers were supposed to do. I never once asked for anything back, and for a long time that felt like enough. What I didn't notice, not until it was much too late, was how easily that pattern turned into something else entirely. Somewhere along the way, Michael stopped seeing my help as something I chose to give and started seeing it as something he was simply owed, the way you're owed the change from a bill you handed over. I was still his mother in his mind, but I don't think I was fully a person to him anymore, not one with limits or needs or a life of my own that deserved protecting. The car at the center of all this was a silver 2015 Toyota Camry, paid off completely. The last big thing Harold and I ever bought together before he got sick. It wasn't fancy, it was reliable, and it was mine, and every time I sat behind that wheel, I thought of him telling me it would run for 20 years if I took care of it, and I had taken care of it, every single oil change, every single year. 2 years ago, when Michael was between jobs and his own car had transmission trouble, I added him as an authorized user on my credit card, just so he could put gas in his car and get to interviews without asking me for cash every week. I told him, clearly, that it was for emergencies only. Gas, maybe groceries in a pinch, nothing more than that. He said, of course, Mom, I would never take advantage, and I believed him completely because he was my son, and because believing him cost me nothing at the time. I also, around that same period, signed a limited power of attorney so Michael could handle a few small things for me while I recovered from a hip replacement, renewing my car registration, picking up a prescription, signing for a package. It was meant to last 3 months. I never formally revoked it afterward, mostly because I forgot it existed, and because I trusted my son more than I trusted my own memory to keep track of paperwork like that. That trust is the hinge this whole story turns on. And I want you to sit with that for a moment because I think so many of us hand over exactly that kind of trust without ever imagining it could be used against us. We don't build locks against our own children. We build our whole lives assuming they will handle us gently, the way we handled them. Michael got engaged last spring to a young woman named Ashley, and I was happy for him, genuinely happy. The kind of happy that comes with a little ache in it because you know your child is starting a life that will have less and less room for you in it. I liked Ashley well enough. She was polite to my face, complimentary about my cooking, and utterly unreadable underneath all of it, the way some young people are when they've decided you're not really worth the effort of being fully honest with. The wedding planning started small, and it grew the way these things always seem to grow. A modest backyard ceremony becoming a rented venue, becoming a catering contract, becoming a guest list of 140 people, becoming a dress that Ashley described to me once, almost apologetically, as costing more than my first car ever had. I didn't say anything critical at the time. I told myself it was their day, their choice, their money to spend as they pleased. Except it wasn't only their money, not for long, and that is where the second act of this story really begins, in the quiet arithmetic of a credit card statement I almost didn't bother to open. The charges started small enough that I nearly missed them entirely, a florist deposit here, a tailor's alteration fee there, amounts under $200 that could have been anything, gas, a grocery run, an emergency I hadn't heard about yet. I told myself Michael was being responsible, using the card exactly the way we'd agreed, for the occasional real need, and I let 3 months pass without asking a single question, because asking felt like an accusation I didn't want to make against my own son. By early summer, the charges had changed character entirely. A $1,200 deposit to a banquet hall called River Bend Manor, an $800 payment to a catering company, a $400 charge from a bridal boutique that I recognized with a sinking feeling as the very same shop where Ashley had described her dress. None of these were gas station charges, none of these were groceries, these were wedding expenses, charged directly to the card I had given my son for emergencies only, without so much as a phone call to ask if it was all right. I called Michael the evening I finally added it all up, my hands actually shaking a little as I dialed, because some part of me already knew what kind of answer I was going to get and dreaded it anyway. He picked up cheerfully, the way he always did, and when I asked about the charges, there was a pause, just long enough for me to feel my stomach drop, before he said in the same casual tone you'd used to mention the weather, that yes, he'd used the card for a few wedding things, but it was really nothing, and he'd been meaning to tell me eventually. I asked him what eventually meant exactly, and he laughed, actually laughed, and said something like, "Mom, it's not like you're using that money for anything urgent right now, and I promise I'll pay you back after the honeymoon." I sat there in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, and felt something in my chest crack quietly down the middle, not loud enough for him to hear over the phone, but real all the same. What hurt wasn't only the money, though $6,200 is not a small sum on a fixed income, no matter how carefully you've saved. What hurt was the casualness, the complete absence of any sense that he had done something wrong. He wasn't apologizing, he was explaining, the way you explain something to a person you expect to simply understand and forgive without friction, because that is the role you've assigned them in your life. I told him, gently, that I needed him to stop using the card for anything beyond what we'd originally agreed, and he said, "Sure, Mom, of course," in a tone that told me he wasn't really hearing it as a boundary at all, just as a mother fussing the way mothers do. I hung up the phone that night and sat in the dark kitchen for a long while, the way you do when you're trying to decide whether something is truly as bad as it feels, or whether you're simply being an old woman who worries too much about money that isn't strictly yours to control anymore, since I had, after all, given him that card myself. If any of this sounds familiar to you, if you've ever had a child explain away something that quietly broke your trust and make you feel like the unreasonable one for noticing, I want you to know that feeling is not something you're imagining. It's real, and it deserves to be named, even when the person doing it to you is someone you carried inside your own body for 9 months. And if this story is already reminding you of your own life, Please subscribe, it costs nothing, and it helps me keep telling stories for people exactly like you. Over the following weeks, I started paying closer attention, not out of suspicion exactly, but out of a kind of quiet vigilance I hadn't needed in years. I noticed Michael visiting more often, always warm, always affectionate, always somehow steering conversation toward the wedding budget, toward how expensive everything had become, toward how stressed he and Ashley were about covering it all. He never asked me outright for more money. He simply talked around the subject long enough that I usually offered something myself because that had always been our pattern. And old patterns are hard to break even when you can feel them costing you something. I brought up the credit card charges once more at a Sunday dinner in June, trying to keep my voice light so it wouldn't sound like an accusation. Michael's jaw tightened for just a second before he smiled again and said he had it handled, that I shouldn't worry about numbers, that this was supposed to be a happy time for the family. Ashley, sitting beside him, gave me a small, tight smile of her own and changed the subject to the weather, and I understood in that moment that I was not meant to push any further. What I didn't know yet, sitting at that table, was that the credit card was only the smaller half of what was coming. By midsummer, the wedding costs had clearly outgrown whatever Michael and Ashley had originally budgeted, and the visits to my house grew more frequent, always wrapped in affection, always landing eventually on some new expense that had cropped up. I started to feel less like a mother being visited and more like an account being managed, though I couldn't have said that out loud to anyone at the time, not even to myself in so many words. I noticed, too, that Michael had taken to asking about my car in strange little ways, how often I actually drove it anymore, whether I'd thought about how expensive insurance and gas had become for a woman my age who mostly just drove to church and the grocery store. I brushed it off as idle conversation, the kind adult children make when they're worried about aging parents, and told him I was perfectly capable of managing my own car. Thank you. Looking back now, I can see exactly what those conversations were, testing the ground, checking whether I would notice, whether I would resist, whether the idea of losing that car would even register with me before it was already gone. At the time, though, I only felt a small unease I couldn't quite name. The kind of feeling you get when something is wrong in a room, but you can't identify which piece of furniture has been moved. My daughter Susan, who lives 2 hours away in Columbus, called me most Sundays, and during one of those calls in July I mentioned, almost in passing, how strange Michael had been acting about money and about the car. Susan went quiet for a moment and then said something I've never forgotten. She said, "Mom, I love my brother, but you have spent your whole life making things easy for him, and I'm worried he doesn't know how to see you as anything except the person who makes things easy." I didn't want to believe her, not fully, not yet. There was a specific evening in late July that I keep returning to in my mind, a rehearsal dinner planning session at Michael's apartment, where Ashley's mother was also present, a sharp, well-dressed woman who made polite conversation about venues and flowers while glancing at me every so often with an expression I couldn't quite place, something between curiosity and pity, as though she already knew something about my situation that I did not yet know myself. At one point that evening, Ashley's mother mentioned casually how generous it was that I was helping so much with the wedding costs, and I remember the confused look I must have given her, because I genuinely didn't know what she meant. Michael quickly changed the subject, laughing it off as his future mother-in-law exaggerating, but the comment sat in my stomach like a stone for days afterward, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a version of this wedding's financing being discussed among people who were not me, one I hadn't agreed to and didn't fully understand. I started quietly to keep my own records after that evening, not because I suspected anything as serious as what was actually happening, but because some old instinct in me, the same instinct that had kept a household budget balanced for 4 decades, told me that I needed to know exactly where my own money and my own property stood. I began checking my credit card statement online every single week instead of once a month. And I began, without telling anyone, keeping a small notebook by my recliner where I wrote down anything that felt even slightly off. I called my oldest friend Grace that week, a woman I've known since we were both young mothers pushing strollers around the same city park more than 40 years ago, and I told her everything, The credit card, the strange comments about the car, the odd look from Ashley's mother. Grace listened without interrupting, the way only a very old friend can. And then she told me about her own nephew, who had quietly drained her sister's savings account years before under the guise of managing her investments, and how her sister hadn't seen it clearly until the damage was already done. Grace said, "Margaret, you notice things most people would rather not notice, and that has always been your gift. Don't let anyone talk you out of trusting it now." That conversation with Grace sent my mind back unexpectedly to my own mother, who raised 5 children through the tail end of the Depression on a railroad worker's wages, and who used to say that a woman's independence was the only inheritance that could never be taken from her, so long as she kept her own name on her own paper. My mother kept a coffee can of cash hidden behind the flour bin her entire life. Not because she didn't trust banks, but because she never wanted to be in a position where she had to ask anyone, including her own husband, for permission to buy what she needed. I'd spent my whole adult life believing I had honored that lesson, and sitting at my kitchen table that week, I began to wonder uncomfortably whether I had let it slip further than I realized. One afternoon in early August, running errands, I found myself driving past the bridal boutique downtown, the same one whose charge had appeared on my statement months earlier, and on an impulse I couldn't fully explain even to myself, I parked and went inside, telling the young clerk I was simply curious about a dress for an upcoming event. She was friendly and eager, and when I mentioned carefully that my daughter-in-law's dress must have needed quite a bit of alteration work, the clerk brightened and said, "Oh, you must be Michael's mother. We were so glad the family could cover the rush fee. That's so generous of you. Most families don't come through like that for extra fittings." I smiled and thanked her and walked back out to my car with my heart pounding, because I had not agreed to any rush fee, and yet somehow, to a stranger behind a counter, I had already been cast as the generous family matriarch quietly footing the bill, a role I had never once been asked whether I wanted to play. None of what I found in August prepared me for what happened in September, but I want you to understand that by the time the real blow landed, some quiet, careful part of me had already started building a case without even fully admitting to myself that I was doing it. The morning it happened, I had a cardiology appointment scheduled for 9:15, a routine follow-up after a small scare with my blood pressure earlier that year, the kind of appointment you don't want to be late for because the office overbooks and makes you wait for hours if you miss your slot. I got dressed, gathered my purse and my insurance card, and walked out to the garage the way I had 1,000 mornings before, expecting to see my silver Camry sitting exactly where I had parked it 2 days earlier. The garage was empty, not moved, not shifted to make room for something else. Simply empty, concrete floor and old paint cans and nothing where a car should have been. I stood in that doorway for what felt like a very long time, my keys still in my hand, my mind refusing at first to process what my eyes were plainly telling me, because there are some absences that your brain simply will not accept in the first few seconds, the way you might stand at a grave and still expect the person to answer if you spoke their name. I called the police first, my hand shaking so badly I had to try the phone number twice, certain in that moment that my car had been stolen, that some stranger had broken into my garage in the night and driven away with the last big thing my husband and I had bought together. The officer who came was kind and patient, and he asked all the routine questions. When had I last seen the car? Did I have the keys? Had I given anyone else access to the vehicle or its paperwork? It was that last question, about paperwork, that made something cold settle into my chest even before I called Michael. I thought suddenly of the power of attorney I had signed 2 years earlier and never formally revoked. I thought of Michael picking up my registration renewal that same year. I thought of the title, which I kept in a folder in my bedroom closet and which I hadn't actually looked at in longer than I wanted to admit. I called Michael from the driveway, still standing there in my church clothes, my cardiology appointment already forgotten, and he answered on the second ring, his voice bright and slightly rushed, the voice of a man in the middle of wedding preparations who didn't have much time to talk. I asked him as calmly as I could manage whether he knew anything about my car being gone, and there was that same pause I remembered from the credit card conversation, that half-second of hesitation before the explanation arrived fully formed. He told me, in almost the exact same tone he'd used months earlier, that he'd sold the Camry the week before to help cover the final catering balance and the last payment on Ashley's dress, that the wedding was in 10 days and they were short, and that he figured I barely drove it anymore anyway, mostly to church and back, and that he could help me arrange rides whenever I needed them. He said it the way you'd mention lending someone an umbrella, not the way you'd mention selling your mother's car out from under her without a single word of warning. I asked him how he had even been able to sell it since the title was in my name and I certainly hadn't signed anything recently, and after another pause he admitted, almost sheepishly, that he'd used the old power of attorney paperwork, the one from my hip surgery, to complete the paperwork at the dealership that bought it, telling them he was authorized to act on my behalf, which, on paper at least, he technically still was since I had never revoked it. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me, standing there in my own driveway, because I understood in that instant that this had not been a spontaneous decision made under pressure. This had required planning, locating the old paperwork, understanding that it was still technically valid, finding a dealership willing to accept it, and driving the car there himself, all without a single phone call to the woman whose name was actually on that title. I asked him, my voice quieter now than I intended, whether he understood that what he had described sounded very much like he had taken my car without my permission, using paperwork that was never meant for something like this. He sighed, the particular sigh of someone who feels unfairly put upon, and said, "Mom, please don't make this into some big legal thing. It's just a car, and I'm getting married in 10 days, and I really don't have the energy for this right now." And then, almost as an afterthought, in the same breath as his complaint about my supposedly overreacting, he mentioned the wedding again, the 10 days, the timeline, and I asked him, since we were already discussing the wedding, what time the ceremony was starting so I could plan around my rearranged transportation situation. There was a silence on the line then, longer than any pause before it, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its casual confidence entirely. He said quietly that the wedding was actually smaller than I might have expected, more intimate, mostly Ashley's side of the family, and a few close friends, and that he and Ashley had decided, given some tension around planning, to keep the guest list tight. I asked him directly, my heart already sinking toward my shoes, whether that meant I was invited or not. Another silence, and then, finally, the answer I had somehow already known was coming before I ever asked the question out loud. "No, Mom, we didn't put you on the list. I'm sorry. It's not personal." I stood in my driveway, phone still pressed to my ear, the empty garage behind me, and I understood in one long, cold moment exactly what had happened to me. My car had paid for a wedding I would not be permitted to attend. The son I had raised, fed, clothed, financed, and forgiven 1,000 small debts for, had decided somewhere along the way that I was worth less to him than a caterer's final invoice. I remember, standing there in that driveway, thinking oddly of Harold, of the Saturday afternoon, nearly a decade earlier, when we'd driven that Camry off the dealer's lot together. How he'd patted the dashboard like greeting an old friend and told me, "Margaret, take care of this one. It'll outlive us both if you let it." I hadn't expected it to outlive our marriage instead, sold off in a matter of minutes by our own son to pay for flowers and catering for a wedding I would never see. The unfairness of it sat in my throat like something swallowed too large, and I found myself absurdly apologizing out loud to an empty garage, as though I owed the car itself something for failing to protect it. I want to tell you honestly, if you've ever had a moment like that one, standing in some version of your own driveway, staring at some version of your own absence, you know there is a particular kind of silence that follows. It isn't calm. It's the sound of something inside you deciding very quietly that it will never fully trust the same way again. If this is landing somewhere true in your chest right now, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, because I think there are more of us out there than anyone admits. I didn't scream at Michael that day, though I think a part of me wanted to. I told him, in a voice that surprised me with how steady it came out, that we would talk again once he'd had time to think about what he'd actually done, and I hung up the phone before he could offer another casual apology that would only have made the wound deeper. Then I went inside, sat down at my kitchen table, and let myself cry for exactly as long as I needed to, which turned out to be a very long time indeed. But crying, I want you to understand, was not the last thing I did that day. It was only the first. After I had cried myself out at that kitchen table, something shifted in me, quietly but completely, the way weather changes when you're not watching the sky directly, but you can feel the pressure drop in your bones anyway. I was not going to scream, and I was not going to beg my son to feel remorse he clearly did not feel on his own. I was going to do what I had always done with every hard thing in my life: gather the facts, understand exactly what had happened, and decide calmly what came next. I started by pulling every credit card statement from the past year, printing each one at the little library branch 2 blocks from my house because my old printer had stopped working ages ago and I'd never bothered replacing it. I highlighted every charge Michael had made that fell outside our original agreement, gas and small emergencies only, and the total, once I added it all up properly, came to $6,240. Almost all of it tied directly to wedding vendors. Then I called the dealership Michael had mentioned, a used car lot on the east side of town called Coleman Auto Sales, and asked as politely as I could manage, while my hands trembled slightly on the receiver, whether they could tell me anything about the sale of a silver 2015 Camry the previous week. The young man who answered was hesitant at first, citing privacy concerns, until I explained calmly that the title was in my name and that I had not personally authorized the sale. He put me on hold, and when he came back, his voice had changed, careful now, almost apologetic. He confirmed that a man identifying himself as Michael, my son, had brought in the vehicle along with a power of attorney document and completed the sale for $8,500, and that the paperwork on file listed an expiration date that had, in fact, already passed 6 months before the sale took place. I sat with that information for a long moment because it changed everything. The power of attorney I had signed was explicitly limited to 3 months for a very specific set of tasks related to my hip surgery recovery, and it had expired half a year before Michael ever walked into that dealership. Whatever he had shown them, whatever confidence he had projected, he had used an invalid, expired document to sell a car that was not legally his to sell, at a dealership that apparently had not checked the paperwork as carefully as they should have. I asked the young man if he could send me a copy of everything on file, and to my relief he agreed, explaining that given what I'd told him about the expired authorization, the dealership would want documentation on their end as well, in case there were legal questions later. Within 2 days I had in my hands a copy of the sale agreement, a copy of the expired power of attorney, and a note confirming the buyer's information, everything I needed to understand exactly how thoroughly my trust had been used against me. My next call was to my longtime bank, where I had kept accounts for over 30 years, and I asked to speak with someone about the unauthorized credit card charges and what my options might be. I was connected with a woman named Diane Ortiz, a fraud and dispute specialist who listened to my entire story without a single interruption, taking careful notes, and who told me something I will never forget. She said, "Mrs. Whitman, what you're describing isn't simply a family disagreement about money. Depending on the details, this may constitute financial exploitation of an older adult, which is a specific legal category in Ohio, and you have real options here." Diane walked me through the process of formally disputing the unauthorized charges, since they had exceeded the scope I had originally agreed to, when adding Michael as an authorized user, and she also gave me the name of an elder law attorney, a woman named Patricia Coleman, who specialized in exactly this kind of situation. Cases where an adult child had misused financial access or expired legal authority against an aging parent. I called Patricia Coleman's office the very next morning, and I want to tell you honestly, my hand hovered over the phone for a long while before I actually dialed, because some old part of me still felt like calling a lawyer about my own son was a kind of betrayal, as though loyalty meant absorbing whatever was done to me without complaint. But I thought of that empty garage, and I thought of the words he'd said, "It's not like you're using that money for anything urgent right now," and I dialed the number. Patricia Coleman was a calm, precise woman in her 50s with a quiet way of listening that made me feel for the first time in weeks like someone was actually taking my situation seriously instead of waving it away as an old woman making a fuss over nothing. She reviewed the expired power of attorney, the dealership paperwork, and the credit card statements, and she told me plainly that what had occurred met the legal definition of exploitation. The sale of the vehicle in particular, since the authorizing document had expired months before the transaction took place. She explained that I had several paths available to me. I could pursue a civil claim against Michael for the value of the vehicle, since the sale itself may have been legally void given the expired authorization. I could file a report with Ohio's Adult Protective Services, since financial exploitation of an older adult is taken seriously under state law, regardless of the family relationship involved. And I could, if I chose, notify the dealership formally that the sale may need to be reversed or compensated given that they had accepted invalid paperwork. Sitting in Patricia's office that first afternoon, looking at the folder of documents I had assembled almost without realizing I was building a case, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph exactly, and not anger either, but a kind of steadiness, the sense that I was no longer simply the person things happened to. I was, for the first time in this whole ordeal, someone taking deliberate, careful action. Patricia asked me one question before I left her office that day that I've thought about often since. She asked, "Mrs. Whitman, what is it you actually want out of this? Not what you think you're supposed to want, but what you actually want." And I told her, honestly, that I didn't want to destroy my son. I wanted the truth to be known, plainly and publicly enough, that he could never again pretend this had been some small, forgivable oversight. I wanted my money back. And I wanted, more than anything, for him to finally understand that I was a person, not a resource. Over the following 2 weeks, while wedding invitations were surely finding their way to 140 guests who were not me, I worked quietly with Patricia to prepare a formal notice, a document laying out the expired power of attorney, the unauthorized credit card charges, and the improperly executed vehicle sale, along with a demand for restitution of the full amount, $6,240 from the card and $8,500 for the car, totaling $14,740. I want to be honest with you about something else too during those 2 weeks. It was not easy. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I was overreacting, if some part of this really was just a mother being too sensitive about money that in the end I could technically afford to lose. But then I would remember the casual cruelty in his voice. "It's not like you're using that money for anything urgent right now." And I would remember that this wasn't really about the money at all. It was about being seen as disposable by the one person who was supposed to see me most clearly. If any part of this story feels like your own life reflected back at you, if you've ever had to build a quiet case for your own dignity because nobody around you was going to hand it to you willingly, I want you to know that instinct is not bitterness. It's wisdom, hard-won and completely justified. And if you're finding strength in hearing that from someone who's lived it, please hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it lets me keep bringing these stories to the people who need them most. I called Grace again the night before I finalized my decision about how and where to speak, and she came over with a pot of coffee and sat with me at the same kitchen table where this whole ordeal had started, and we practiced, almost like actors rehearsing lines, exactly what I might say and how I might say it without my voice breaking halfway through. Grace kept reminding me that I did not need to raise my voice to be heard, that the facts themselves, laid out plainly, would carry more weight than any anger I could summon, and by the end of that evening I felt something settle in me that had been unsteady for weeks. A quiet, sturdy resolve that had nothing left to do with hoping Michael would simply come to his senses on his own. Patricia and I decided together on the venue for delivering this notice. Not a courtroom, not initially, but the rehearsal dinner 3 days before the wedding, where Michael, Ashley, both families, and a small circle of close friends would be gathered in one room, a setting where the truth could be spoken plainly without ambush, but without any further opportunity for quiet dismissal either. I called Michael the week before the rehearsal dinner and told him calmly that I would be attending, even though I hadn't been invited to the wedding itself. He was quiet for a long moment and then said, almost warily, that of course I could come to the rehearsal dinner that hadn't been in question, as though the exclusion from the actual wedding was somehow a separate, unrelated matter that required no explanation at all. I spent those final days before the rehearsal dinner in a strange, focused calm, organizing my documents into a single folder, rehearsing in my mind exactly what I would say and exactly what I would not say, because I had decided early on that this moment needed to be about truth, not humiliation. I did not want to embarrass Michael for the sake of embarrassing him. I wanted the facts, plainly stated, to do the work that his own conscience had so far failed to do. The rehearsal dinner was held at a modest Italian restaurant on the north side of town, a private back room with a long table set for perhaps 30 people, string lights, the smell of garlic and fresh bread, the sound of laughter that hadn't yet learned what was coming. Ashley's parents were there, warm and a little formal, along with a scattering of aunts and cousins and old family friends I had known for years. People who had watched Michael grow up, people who had, in some cases, watched me raise him almost entirely on my own during the years Harold worked double shifts. I arrived a little early, my folder of documents in a plain manila envelope inside my purse, and I sat quietly near the middle of the table, exchanging pleasant small talk with people I hadn't seen in months, aware the entire time of the particular weight sitting against my hip. Michael greeted me warmly when he arrived, a kiss on the cheek, a comment about how nice I looked, as though the last several weeks hadn't happened at all, as though an empty garage and an empty guest list were simply things that had quietly resolved themselves. Dinner proceeded pleasantly enough through the appetizers and into the main course. Toasts beginning to circulate, Ashley's father standing to say a few warm words about welcoming Michael into their family, about how much he had come to admire him over the past year. I sat through all of it with a strange, still patience, waiting, not for an opportunity exactly, but for the natural moment when speaking would feel honest rather than disruptive. That moment came near the end of dinner, when Michael himself stood to offer a toast, thanking everyone for being there, thanking his future in-laws for their generosity, thanking Ashley for changing his life. And then, almost as an afterthought, he thanked me too, for, in his words, always being so supportive, always making things work out somehow, and I watched several people around the table smile warmly at what sounded like a lovely tribute to a devoted mother. I stood up slowly when he finished, my heart pounding harder than I expected, but my hands, when I reached into my purse for the envelope, were steadier than they had any right to be. I said, quietly but clearly enough for the room to hear, that I wanted to thank Michael too, for something specific, for showing me this year exactly how much I actually mean to him, and for teaching me in the process something important about the difference between being loved and being used. The room went very still. I opened the envelope and set the papers on the table in front of me, not waving them dramatically, simply placing them there, plainly visible. I explained in the same even, unhurried voice I had used with Patricia in her office that the credit card I had given Michael for emergencies had been used to fund $6,240 of wedding expenses without my knowledge or consent. I explained that my car, the one Harold and I had bought together before he passed, had been sold using a power of attorney that had legally expired 6 months before the transaction, making the sale improperly executed under Ohio law. Ashley's mother's face went pale. Michael's face went through several expressions in quick succession, confusion, then something like panic, then a kind of pleading look directed at me as though asking me silently to stop before this went any further. But I had decided, sitting in Patricia's office weeks earlier, that stopping was no longer something I was willing to do, simply because it made someone else uncomfortable. I told the table, calmly, that I hadn't come to ruin anyone's evening, and that I loved my son, and that none of this changed the fact that I hoped he and Ashley would build a good life together. But I said that I could no longer stay silent while people believed I had generously helped fund this wedding, when in fact what had actually happened was that my property had been taken from me without permission, using paperwork that had no legal standing at the time it was used. Michael found his voice then, strained and defensive, saying that I was making things sound worse than they were, that he'd always intended to pay me back, that this wasn't the time or the place for this conversation. And I looked at him, my son, the boy I had rocked to sleep 1,000 nights, and I said gently but without wavering that I had tried repeatedly to have this conversation privately, and each time he had brushed it aside as unimportant. So yes, perhaps this was exactly the time and place, since privacy had not seemed to matter to him when he sold my car without telling me either. Ashley's father, to his credit, asked quietly whether what I was describing was accurate, and I handed him the copy of the dealership paperwork showing the expiration date on the power of attorney 6 months before the sale, the discrepancy stark and undeniable in black and white ink. He read it slowly, his expression darkening, and then looked at Michael with an expression I recognized immediately, the particular disappointment of a father-in-law realizing something important about the man his daughter was about to marry. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic collapse of the evening into chaos. There was instead a long, uncomfortable silence, the kind that says more than any raised voice ever could, followed by Ashley quietly asking Michael, in a small, shaken voice, whether what his mother was saying was true. And Michael, faced with documentation he could not argue away, finally admitted quietly that yes, it was true, that he had used the expired paperwork because he knew on some level that asking me directly might have meant hearing the word no. I want to pause here and tell you something important. This was not a moment of vengeance for me. I felt no triumph watching my son's face fall in front of people he wanted to impress. What I felt more than anything was a strange, aching relief. The relief of finally being believed, of finally having the truth exist in a room full of witnesses, instead of trapped inside my own chest, where only I could feel its weight. If you've ever needed the truth to simply exist out loud, witnessed by people who couldn't dismiss it as your imagination or your oversensitivity, you understand exactly what that relief feels like. It isn't happiness, it's the sound of a held breath finally let go. And if that resonates with you tonight, I hope you'll subscribe and stay with me, because these stories only keep reaching people like you if enough of us choose to keep sharing them forward. The rehearsal dinner ended earlier than planned, quietly, with Ashley's mother offering to walk me to my car, forgetting for a moment with visible embarrassment that I no longer had a car to walk to, and instead offering to drive me home herself, an act of kindness from someone I barely knew that meant more to me than she probably ever understood. Michael did not come after me as I left. I don't know, even now, whether that was shame or simple avoidance, and I've decided it doesn't matter much either way. The wedding, as it turned out, happened 3 days later as scheduled, though I heard from Susan afterward that the atmosphere had been noticeably subdued, that several relatives had quietly asked Michael afterward about the things I'd said, and that Ashley herself had apparently insisted in the days between the rehearsal dinner and the ceremony that Michael contact me and begin making things right regardless of what happened with the wedding itself. In the weeks following the wedding, with Patricia Coleman's guidance, Michael agreed to a formal restitution arrangement rather than facing a civil claim or a report to Adult Protective Services, which I had genuinely been prepared to file if he had refused to cooperate. He agreed to repay the $6,240 from the credit card charges over the following year, and separately working with the dealership, which acknowledged that the sale documentation had been improperly accepted given the expired authorization, arranged a settlement covering the $8,500 for the car, split between Michael and the dealership's own error in not verifying the paperwork more carefully. Susan called me the morning after the rehearsal dinner, having heard the whole story secondhand from a cousin who'd been sitting near the back of the room, and her voice was thick with something between anger and relief. She said, "Mom, I've watched you make things easy for Michael my entire life, and some part of me has been waiting years for the day you finally stopped, and I'm sorry it took something this painful to get you there, but I'm proud of you." We talked for almost 2 hours that day, longer than we had in months, and for the first time I told her honestly how frightened I had been, standing up at that table, how my legs had actually trembled beneath the tablecloth, even as my voice stayed steady. A few weeks after the wedding, I received an unexpected handwritten note from Ashley asking if we might meet for coffee, just the two of us. I almost didn't go, unsure what to expect, but I'm glad I did. She told me, sitting across from me at a small diner near my house, that she hadn't known the full truth about the power of attorney until the night of the rehearsal dinner, that Michael had told her only that his mother was helping generously with a few costs, and that learning otherwise had shaken something loose in how she saw him. She apologized, simply and without excuses, for not asking harder questions herself, and I found myself unexpectedly comforting her rather than the other way around, because I could see she was carrying her own version of the same betrayal I had carried. I want to tell you plainly, receiving that money back did not undo what had happened. It did not erase the morning I stood in an empty garage, or the sentence, "We didn't put you on the list," spoken so casually into a phone. But it did something else important. It established in clear, undeniable terms that what had happened to me was wrong. Not just emotionally, but factually, legally, on paper, in a way that could never again be waved away as an old woman overreacting. More important than the money, though, was the conversation Michael and I finally had, weeks after the wedding, sitting at the same kitchen table where I had cried alone the day I discovered my car was gone. He came to me on his own, without Ashley, without an audience, and told me, in a voice quieter and more genuine than I had heard from him in a very long time, that he was sorry, not the casual, dismissive sorry he'd offered before, but something that sounded like actual understanding of what he had taken from me. I told him honestly that I forgave him, because I did, and because carrying anger toward my own son for the rest of my life was never going to serve either of us well. But I also told him, just as honestly, that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, and it did not mean returning to the way things had been before, where my generosity was simply assumed, expected, treated as a resource to be managed rather than a gift freely given by a person with her own needs and her own limits. I set new terms after that conversation, quietly but firmly. No more shared credit cards, no more standing financial arrangements of any kind. Any future help I chose to give, and I told him clearly there might well be future help, would be a deliberate decision made by me, discussed openly in advance, never simply assumed or taken. I also revoked, formally and permanently this time, with Patricia's help, any power of attorney documents that had ever existed between us, making certain nothing like this could ever happen again through some forgotten piece of paper in a drawer. Michael accepted these terms without argument, which told me something important in itself, that some part of him had understood. Finally, that he had crossed a line that could not simply be smoothed over with charm and a casual apology, the way so many things had been smoothed over between us before. Our relationship today is different than it was before all this happened. Quieter in some ways, more careful, but also, I think, more honest, built now on something closer to mutual respect than on old assumptions I should have questioned years earlier. I went back to Patricia Coleman's office one final time that autumn to sign the formal revocation of every old power of attorney document that had ever existed between Michael and me, and to close the file on the restitution agreement. Her office smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, the way law offices always seem to, and I remember watching her stamp the final page with a small, ordinary rubber stamp, thinking how strange it was that something so quiet and unremarkable could mark the end of something that had nearly broken me. Patricia looked up at me and said, "Mrs. Whitman, I want you to know, not every client in your position finds the strength to see this through to the end. And I hope you feel, whatever else you feel, that you did right by yourself." I drove home that day, with the windows down, even though it was already growing cold, just to feel the air on my face. I bought a new car a few weeks later, a modest used sedan, dark blue this time instead of silver, paid for entirely with the restitution money, and I remember the test drive vividly. The salesman, a patient young man who let me take my time on the back roads outside town, past the old dairy farm Harold and I used to drive by on Sunday afternoons. When I finally sat in my own driveway afterward, engine off, keys resting in my palm, I let myself cry again, differently this time. Not the raw grief of the empty garage, but something closer to relief, the particular relief of holding once more a piece of your own life entirely in your own hands. These days, my life has settled into a rhythm that feels, in its own quiet way, more solid than it did before any of this happened. I drive myself to church on Sundays in my dark blue sedan, and afterward I usually stop by Grace's house for coffee, and most weeks I talk to Susan on the phone, and every other month or so Michael comes by for dinner, alone now, without an audience, and we talk more honestly than we ever did before, about small things mostly, his job, my garden, the weather. But underneath it there is a new kind of carefulness between us that I have come to value far more than the easy, unquestioned closeness we used to have. I keep my important papers in a locked file box now, in my own closet, and I review them myself every few months. A habit Patricia encouraged me to build regardless of how much I trust the people around me. It isn't about suspicion. It's about remembering that dignity, once you've had to fight to reclaim it, is worth the small effort of protecting going forward. I am 72 years old, and I raised a good man who made one very bad decision, and both of those things can be true at the same time without either one canceling the other out. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. Loving someone completely does not mean allowing them to treat you as though your needs, your property, and your dignity are simply theirs to manage as they see fit. You can love your children fiercely, generously for your entire life, and still hold the line when they forget that you are a person, not a resource to be drawn upon whenever convenient. I paid for my son's wedding with my own car, and I did not even have a seat at the table that day. But I want you to know that I found my seat again, eventually, not at his wedding, but at my own table, in my own home, with my own name on my own paperwork, and nobody's signature but mine, deciding what happens to what is mine from now on. If this story meant something to you tonight, please subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear it too. It's free, it takes only a moment, and it's the only way these stories keep finding the people who need them. Thank you for listening to mine. Take care of yourselves and take care of what's yours.